Cari studenti, ciao a tutti and welcome to this short interview with Michael Curtotti. Dr. Curtotti is a translator, among many other wonderful things that he does, and he has recently translated one of the works of Matteo Bandello, which is the story of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo e Giulietta, that you probably know from Shakespeare. And today we are going to talk a little bit about this work. We are going to talk a bit about Bandello, and we are going to work about the influence, direct or indirect, you will tell us, of Bandello on Shakespeare. So first of all, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Francesco. I'm really delighted to be here today, and it's a great pleasure to be talking about this topic. It's a bit of a passion topic for me, and I grew up near Canberra, and most of my life is around the ANU campus, so this is a lovely opportunity to give back in a sense. I'm an Italian-Australian by background, and I guess when I was younger, I didn't have much of an interest in Italy from an intellectual point of view, but later in life, I've really found a passion for it. So I've been writing for the last few years about Italian culture, Italian history, Italian literature, and discovering wonderful stories there. And it's through that journey that I've discovered Matteo Bandello. That's a little bit about
Yeah.
myself.
And can you tell us why you decided to translate in particular this work, Matteo Bandello's Romeo and Juliet or Romeo e Giulietta?
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. But the spark was really my wife and I were traveling to Italy, and we were going to visit Verona, and for the first time. And I thought on the flight over they were showing Shakespeare in Love, and I thought I'd watch it, just to prepare for the visit. But it was kind of a disappointing experience, even though it's a wonderful movie and it's brilliant art in its own right. It really plays very fast and loose with history. I'll read, how the movie is pitched, just to give a sense of, how the story is told. The world's greatest ever playwright, William Shakespeare, is young, out of ideas, and short on cash. But he meets his ideal woman and is inspired to write one of his most famous plays. This just never happened. It's a great story, but it didn't happen that way. Shakespeare was, in fact, inspired by the love of great Italian literature rather than a woman in London. So after kind of experiencing that and knowing a little bit about Bandello at that point, I was really kind of had this urge to want to make this story more known and to undertake translation of his version of Romeo and Juliet. And one of the interesting things is so many people I've met on this journey, when I tell them I'm doing this, they say, oh, I didn't know there was an Italian novella or an Italian story that inspired the play. But often people are delighted to discover that. So,
Yeah. And some of our students, well, they're all studying Italian, of course, and some of them might become very good and decide one day to translate some other important works. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience of actually translating this work?
Sure. So, first of all, I'd really encourage anyone who's interested in tackling translation to have a go. It's quite a different way of experiencing a text. And for me, there's really two aspects of that. The first is how you read the text. It's a much more intimate reading of what the author is writing, because you're not just enjoying the story, you're trying to really get inside the mind of the author and see what he's saying at a superficial level, but also at a deeper emotional level, and make sure you understand that. And then the second aspect is really how do you express it in a different language, English in this case. And one of the interesting things for me was in that journey, feeling a sense of familiarity as an English speaker of the Italian I was reading in Bandello. And I really wondered about that. And as I've been investigating it further, um, it's there's really an influence of Italian that comes into English during the Elizabethan period. In fact, Queen Elizabeth I herself was fluent in Italian. You won't see that represented in popular media, but this was the kind of world she was in, where people in the court really loved Italian culture. There were many artists engaging with Italy in different ways, and Shakespeare was one of them. And in fact, he drew several stories from Matteo Bandello, the most famous of which is Romeo and Juliet, but Twelfth Night, Much Ado About Nothing, two other examples.
Yeah. So let's get to the core of this interview with Michael and talk a little bit about Matteo Bandello, who was why do we need to study Bandello? Why is it important?
Sure. So I think probably to answer that in a nutshell is he's probably one of the most influential Italian novelieri, if not the most influential Italian novelieri. And his life is interesting in that respect. He was born in 1485 or around then and lived to about 1562. He was born in Piedmont, but lived most of his life in Lombardy. He spent quite a bit of time in Mantua and Verona, so knows them personally. As a child, he was sent into the church, so he became a Dominican monk. But his passion in life, his calling was really as a writer, and he spent a lot of time doing that. When he was born, Lorenzo de' Medici was still still ruling in Florence. So we're in that high Renaissance, high early modern era period. But by the time he dies, the world has completely changed. And he experiences that in his life. Great power politics entered the Italian peninsula. Of course, there wasn't an Italy as such, or a country as such at that time. But France and Spain were engaged in great power rivalry in the Italian peninsula, creating many wars. Matteo Bandello was directly affected by these. Eventually, he had to leave Italy altogether, and he spent the last years of his life in France. Now, he was pretty well connected, so the King of France appointed him as Bishop of Agen. But as we know, he was a writer, and he spent his final years completing his novellas, more than 200 of them, and publishing them. And it wasn't long after that his works began to be published into other languages, translated into French, Spanish, English, German, and he had a very significant influence across Europe and on other artists, and including Shakespeare.
This is very interesting because most of our students probably don't know who Bandello was, but they would know who Shakespeare is, of course. Still a great influence on English and world literature, of course. And I think it's important to remember that many of the authors who were famous during or after their lives and have been very influential, they haven't really become classic authors at the level of, say, Dante or Petrarca or Shakespeare, but they still have had incredible influence on the development of literature in many countries. So let's get now to talk a bit about Romeo and Romeo and Julieta, or Romeo and Juliet, and the relationship, I guess, between Bandello's work and Shakespeare's work. So what is happening there? Is Shakespeare copying from Bandello? Is taking some inspiration from it? What's going on there?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of a key sort of thing to think about in this relationship. And, nowadays we have these ideas of copyright or plagiarism that would kind of say, oh, well, was Shakespeare less original than we thought? but that's really an anachronistic way of thinking about it. In Shakespeare's time, creatives didn't think like that. It was very common, Bandello did this himself, for an author or a writer or a dramatist to take a story, look at it, and if they thought it was a great story, they'd think about how can I make this story even better, and they would do that. And that's exactly what Shakespeare did. So some of the things that are different between the two versions, well, firstly, Bandello is a prose writer, and whereas Shakespeare writes in both poetry and prose. Shakespeare is far more of a wordsmith. He uses words in very complex ways, whereas Bandello is a very direct storyteller. So they're kind of different in that way. But the plot that Bandello gives us is essentially the same plot that we find in Shakespeare's story
Okay.
or Shakespeare's play.
So same plot, but differences perhaps because Shakespeare is maybe a better writer. Can we say that or not?
Yeah, like I think these kind of value judgments are very personal things. So, as an individual, I may like Shakespeare more or I may like Bandello more, but they're very different. And for my mind, I try to appreciate each of them for, their own individual artistry. So Bandello is a beautiful storyteller. I love how he tells the story. Shakespeare is an amazing dramatist, and you even appreciate him more knowing Bandello. That's kind of how I've experienced it.
And you said the plot is pretty much the same, but is there some differences in the plot, in the story, in the character that you think are significant? Is there any element of the story that somehow changes and you think it's important to know?
Yeah, I think this is one of the fun aspects of knowing both these two works, and to see how Shakespeare has improved the story in some cases, but also to see things that have been lost. And also other more subtle differences. For example, in Shakespeare, it starts with the words in fair Verona, but the Verona we read in Shakespeare is really an abstract notion. As far as we know, or it's generally believed, Shakespeare never traveled to Italy. So, and the play is consistent with that idea. Whereas in Bandello, you can actually identify the street where Tybalt and Romeo had their battle and where Romeo kills Tybalt. It's right next to the old castle. It's identified. San Francesco, the church, is still there where Romeo and Juliet get married. So, there's this beautiful aspect of, oh, I can go and visit these places and, sort of participate in the story in a sense.
So maybe if you want to visit Verona while reading about Romeo and Juliet, maybe Bandello's version is better than Shakespeare's one.
Absolutely. And I think on the flight over, I should have been reading Bandello instead of watching the movie. But I absolutely recommend that if you're going to Verona. And it is, as they say, one of the most beautiful cities of Italy.
One final question, Michael. And then if you want to add anything else, of course you can. But one final curiosity for me is we have here Shakespeare, like perhaps the most famous writer in the world ever. And then we have Bandello. And, if I have to guess how many people know Bandello in Australia, we're probably talking about a few hundreds if we are lucky. What happens there? Why is Bandello no longer well known? Why is not even as famous as Shakespeare, but let's say well known among other great Italian writers like Petrarca or Dante or Boccaccio? What happened there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it's worth thinking about. Because, as we've discussed, Bandello was such an influential figure. So why isn't he even more celebrated in Italy? So I think one aspect, like there are a few things I think we can explore. One is changes or in fashion. So Bandello wrote novellas, short stories as part of a broader frame story, very like Boccaccio. That kind of storytelling is kind of fallen out of fashion. We now kind of read novels typically, which are much longer. So, the literature's become less accessible in that sense. Um, Second, I think Bandello, a factor may have been that Bandello's Italian wasn't pure Florentine. He lived in Lombardy most of his life, and he kind of apologizes for that when he starts his book, being very modest because his Italian is actually quite excellent. But if your first priority is absolutely correct Italian grammar, you are going to find things to pick fault with in Bandello. So maybe that was kind of a barrier within Italy.
Yeah. So when you're talking about Italian grammar, you're really talking about the Florentine of the great writers that were the main point of reference. So
Yeah,
Petrarca,
absolutely,
Dante,
absolutely.
Boccaccio, and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So he was certainly, he was very much a proud imitator of Boccaccio,
Yeah.
but he has his own language history that influences how he writes.
Yeah.
A third factor I think that is kind of put Bandello in the shade is Shakespeare.
Right.
Shakespeare has been so successful that like everyone knows the story of Romeo and
Yeah.
Juliet or Shakespeare's story. Even in Italy, like I was doing some searching on the internet to see, well, do they talk about Bandello in Italy? You can find heaps of stuff about Shakespeare's version, but you struggle to find Bandello.
Yeah. So in a sense, if one wants to read the story of Romeo and Julieta, they will probably get to Shakespeare, right?
Yes,
Not to
yeah,
Bandello,
they'll find Shakespeare
and
first.
therefore Shakespeare is so great that everyone in his shadows perhaps tend to disappear.
Yeah, I think that's true, and also in a kind of in subtle ways as well. I think I want to make two comments about that.
Yeah,
One is about how we think about literature. We have national poets. We have this idea that literature is a national thing. So Shakespeare is um, England's national poet, but Dante is Italy's. But of course, literature isn't like that. It flows across boundaries, and these national ideas are actually quite new. And Bandello, I think another factor that is put him in the shade is he kind of sits in the middle because he's this kind of transitional figure between Italian Renaissance literature and English Renaissance literature. So, he's not well placed in how we conceptualize literature. So if we
yeah,
study Italian literature, where does Bandello fit? He's off to the side a little bit,
yeah.
and even more so if you study English literature.
Yeah, and I think this is important because with my students, as they know, we have been studying a lot of canonical authors like Dante, Petrarca, and so on, but we have also looked at writers, intellectuals, and artists who are outside of the canon. And for example, we have looked at a number of women who have been pretty much excluded from the national
Mm,
canon. So I think it's very important that we remember that literature is not just about the nation. In fact, it's about humanity, it's about emotions and sentiments and complex social events and making sense of life and society. And that national element of the great writer of the nation is it's often also an illusion, especially in the case of Italy, where the great poets were not really living in Italy because Italy
mm.
didn't exist at the time. Okay, Michael, I think we are going towards moving quickly towards the end of this interview. So I want to ask you a final question. Why should students really study or remember or get interested in this author? What is the key things that they should remember about this author? Perhaps beyond the influence on Shakespeare, as an author in himself. One thing that, it's
Mm.
really valuable about this writer.
Yeah, it's quite a hard question to answer, but I think what it makes me think about is about the novellas and their. It took me quite a while to really discover them in Italian literature, I guess, and they are, to my mind, they are a really significant element in the evolution of modernity. So Bandello, we've been exploring his influence on Shakespeare. You know, he's writing stories like, for example, a Juliet who is very much a speaker in the way she interacts with the world. We're beginning to question gender relations, even more so in other Italian novelieris like Cinthio, whose stories also end up in Shakespeare, Othello and Measure for Measure. And he's in those. It's kind of a laboratory where they're exploring how men and women should relate to each other and asking quite deep questions that we still ask today, like questions about domestic violence and other sort of issues that are incredibly relevant to our modern times. Bandello's Romeo and Juliet is also about mental health. And this is an element that is lost a little bit in Shakespeare, in the way the story is told in Shakespeare. But in Bandello, it's very central. It drives the plot. So he's asking, how do we better support young people with mental health issues? So I think Bandello's story is important from that point of view too.
So our students will read a very short extract from your great translation of Bandello's work, and also they will try and read the original, and we have prepared also a short extract from Shakespeare so that they can compare them, and then you will be with us in class as well in week 3 to talk a bit more about this, and hopefully there will be an opportunity for students to ask you a few questions and have an interesting discussion. I think we have been working on, how certain ideas of love, for example, and violence and gender relations have changed over time, and what was already apparent at the time that's still with us. So I'm sure our students will have interest in discussing, for instance, this aspect around the mental health of young people and how even centuries ago writers were concerned and were writing about that. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this opportunity to talk to you, and I'll see you in a few days to discuss more about this with our student. Thank you very much, Michael.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Francesco. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to meeting the students.